Hey everybody, what's up? This is Joseph Coyne and welcome to the ASCA podcast. Hey guys, welcome back to the ASCA podcast. I'm your host Joseph Coyne and this is episode 53. Now, besides all the great guests on the podcast, the people who help us to bring this to you and the other coaches, physios, teachers out there is Valid Performance. They make the Nord board, the force frame, human track and force sticks. I'm a big fan of force sticks for jumps and mid-thigh pull diagnostics. We have also been starting to use force sticks for the shoulders with the ASH test and looking at complementing this with the force frame for some internal, external rotation assessments. This is all due to the relative amount of shoulder issues we're getting with the MMA athletes we have in the UFC PI in Shanghai. Anyway, look, in my experience, all of Val's products are very user-friendly and give you data you can action on immediately. So if you're in the market, please reach out to them, valperformance.com, or shoot them an email, info@valperformance.com. Now, we have got an awesome guest for episode number 53, Dan Kadlec. He's currently the S&C coach for Softball Western Australia and also for Claremont Women's Football Club. He's at Edith Cowan University, great university by the way. He's doing a PhD in sports science, sponsored by, guess who, Valid Performance. I kid you not. So they're obviously involved there. He's previously worked in Germany and with the women's rugby sevens teams, also with their women's judo team. He's a certified sports physiotherapist. He's really making me feel bad right now. But anyway, his areas of research interest are biomechanics, coaching science, and in this show we talk his change of direction and agility research along with straight line maximum velocity speed. So without further ado, let's get stuck into this. All right, ASCA podcast time. I'm here with Daniel Kadlec. Mate, thank you for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
So obviously there's an accent there, and I know it's German, but mate, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your experience in sport and S&C? How'd you get to where you are, and what are you actually doing now?
As you can hear based on my accent, I'm born and raised in Germany. I now moved 1.5 years ago to Perth to start my PhD here at the ECU. But it all started like I did my undergrad back home in Germany. After that, I started doing my master's in strength and conditioning at the St. Mary's University in London. But this was like a distance learning course. And also during my last year of my undergrad and my first year of master's, I started to do an additional degree in sports physiotherapy just to understand like the return to play protocols a bit better, which at that time were lacking in my university degree. So I just was curious about, okay, how can I improve the way I coach athletes? And so this is probably from my academia point of view. And during my undergrad, I think it was 2011, I got the opportunity to start helping out as a PT for general population and also started to train under 16 handball players in a tiny private facility, which at that time was run by my friend, David Gruger. And over time, we got more and more PT clients and also were asked to run the S&C program for the local professional handball club. So that we moved 2014 into a 250 square meter facility and started to be a public gym. And over time, we grew and grew. Another pro handball club and another soccer club hired us. So we moved 2017 in a 600 square meter facility. And this was shortly before I left for Australia. So for over 4 years, I was working full-time in a gym and coached whoever entered the facility, basically. And besides that, I was also in charge for the German Sevens women's rugby team for 2 seasons. And in the beginning of 2016, I was asked to help out to coach the centralized judo women's team in preparation for Rio. So again, I did that for about 2 years before I eventually left for Australia. And since I'm here, I'm running in Perth the program for the softball WA Open Women, and I'm also in charge of the Claremont Women's Footy Club. On top of that, I'm trying to help out with the under-18s women's state footy program here. So that's basically all my professional and educational background up to now.
Yeah, wow. What made the choice to come to Australia, to come to Edith Cowan?
Probably summarized, it was like the power of social media. So I was kind of following my supervisor, which is Sophia Nymphius, on Twitter, because I was kind of like fanboying all her research and what she has published so far. And this must be like at the start of 2017. She tweeted out that like, oh, I need I have an opportunity for 2 PhDs with a scholarship. Who is keen? So I kind of like wrote a cold email and was like, hey, dear associate professor Nymphius, I saw your tweet, what it's all about. And then we kept emailing back and forth, Skyped once or twice, and tried to agree on topics which both of us would be interested in. And then at one point she also asked me to like send her a video of me coaching or how I am in front of athletes, because like this position was linked to the softball WA program. And because I was kind of too lazy to do a new video, extra video for that, I just like sent her my Instagram account, which I kind of tried to use only like for me as a coach and not to upload a lot of drunken selfies, whatever. And like in the end, she was kind of happy apparently with that, what I posted. And yeah, then she offered me to do my PhD in conjunction with a scholarship here at ECU. So basically based on Twitter and Instagram, I moved to Australia and living the dream ever since.
Right, the world's getting smaller and smaller with every social media post. It's awesome. It's a really good story, actually. It really is. So this PhD, what's it on? Like, who's it with? What's the deal with it?
So as already mentioned, like Sophia Nymphius is my primary supervisor, and my co-supervisors are Jackie Allison from UWA here and Matt Jordan based in Canada. So this is like the team which is supporting me. And what I'm interested in with my PhD is how isolated and multi-joint capacities affect joint kinetics and movement strategies during change of direction tasks. So basically, we want to quantify the magnitude and the distribution of joint loadings in worst case situation. And in our understanding and based on the literature, we have athletes performing the same task, be it a vertical jump or pre-planned change of direction, in different ways. And generally spoken, we see them having either a hip, knee, or ankle dominance or a balanced approach to solve a task. And which such repeated joint dominances, you'll get certain structures to be very well trained, but also other structures to be underused. And because the athlete usually relies on those preferred movement strategies, what happens if for whatever reason the athlete cannot use those preferred movement strategies in a change of direction task in a game? Well, best case, he gets beaten by the opponent. Worst case, your ACL is gone. And just because you have to rely on structures that are usually underused and therefore underdeveloped. And usually those joint dominances, and different groups use different metrics for this, are quantified by your joint moments, joint powers, or joint work the athlete is demonstrating in a particular task. And with this idea, we want to see in my study how individual athletes choose to execute an unplanned change of direction task to inform the subsequent intervention. And for the unplanned change of direction task, we used a generic stimuli in our testing protocol. So there was an arrow popping up around 400 milliseconds before the athlete hits the force plate. And with this, we wanted to minimize the time the athlete can prepare themselves for the cutting step. So to be truly a worst case scenario. And as we all know, the more time prior to the ultimate cutting step the athlete has to adjust, the lower the joint loading will be. When we put this in a continuum, we know that pre-planned change of direction tasks elicit the lowest joint loading, just because the athlete has enough time to set himself up to master the task as efficiently as possible. If an athlete has, on the other hand, to respond to a human stimulus, like be it on a screen, which by definition is an unplanned condition, the athlete can use the visual cognitive abilities to anticipate the upcoming movement and therefore buy some time in order to prepare and adjust. And although those visual cognitive abilities inevitably differ between athletes, such a scenario still elicits less joint loading than an unplanned condition where the athlete has to respond to a generic stimuli, such as a flashing light or an arrow popping up. And this gives the athlete literally zero time to adjust. And we call it the worst case scenario or the oh shit moment.
So sorry to interrupt. So 400 milliseconds is about what a person would have in a regular, like the average amount of time they'd have to anticipate a movement, or the shortest amount of time they'd have to anticipate a movement in team sports. How'd you come up with that? I'll be really interested.
So the 400 milliseconds, this is kind of the methodology which is used in papers which try to quantify unplanned change of direction mechanics.
Yeah,
so this is from your ipsilateral toe off, the time until your leg hits the force plate for the ultimate cutting step. So you literally lift your leg off, you see the direction the arrow is directing you towards, and then you have to react. So this is probably the way the papers are designed nowadays in order to quantify such change of direction mechanics.
Yeah, wow. And then so what have you found so far? What's been the interesting findings so far?
So long story short, like the interesting finding is that I'm still processing and analyzing the data to tell you exactly what happened after our intervention. And based on this change of direction task we did with them, and on top of that, we also 1RM'd their hip thrust, squat, and seated calf raise in a dynamic traditional way, and also did an isometric test for the hip extensors, knee extensors, and plantar flexors in angles which correspond to the cutting step. And with those two measures, like knowing how the athlete moves and what joint kinetics the athlete produces during the cutting step or during the sidestepping task, and how the raw physical capacities in the gym is, we tried to inform our subsequent intervention on an individual basis. So with, let's say, the athlete had high magnitudes of knee joint power during the unplanned change of direction tasks, aka how much this joint contributes to deceleration, but the knee extensor capacity, your 1RM squat in the gym, was below average. So your athlete was relying on the knee extensors in the change of direction task, but had insufficient capacities in the gym. So for this athlete, clearly the protocol and the intervention was, okay, increase knee extensor strength, be it with your squats or in an isometric way, what have you. And another example was that we saw with some athletes almost zero contribution of your hip extensors during the change of direction task, while also having low gym scores in the hip thrust. So this was, again, a no-brainer. Overload the hip extensors in the hopes to get a more efficient or more effective change of direction pattern. A tricky scenario was when a single joint was underperforming in the change of direction task compared to the other joints while having above average gym scores. So you had the capacity, but you did not use it during the change of direction task. And although in our thinking, this might indicate something is going on with your motor control system and like the way how you choose to move, unfortunately, I can only answer so much questions during my PhD. Nevertheless, with such a scenario,
where are you leaning? Where are you leaning right now? What's your gut telling you about it?
If you want to improve specific or isolated joints during the isolated task, you have to use some sort of constraint-based approach to force the athlete into using, let's say, their hip extensors or their knee extensors during the task. And yeah, having like a constraint-based approach during your cut and holding a weighted implement to make your trunk like more upright, or ducking under to like having to go through a bigger range with your hip extensors. So you overload the hip extensors in this particular movement. So yeah, that would be probably my way how to do it.
Yeah, wow. And then, sorry, just to go back a little bit, you tested them isometrically in these like cutting movements. Can you describe that a little bit more? Because were they in a harness or were they on force plates? What did you do there? I'm sure it'd be very interesting for the listeners.
So we kind of did like a ghetto approach. I had my 2 small Pasco force plates, and one squat rack. And to test isometrically the hip extensors, I just did a hip thrust with about 140 to 150 degrees in your hip, and then just push as hard as you can. With the knee extensors, I just did an isometric squat with knee joint angles at above or around 135 to 140 degrees. And for your ankle, just a seated calf raise with your ankle joint being at about 90 degree of plantar flexion. And those are the angles which corresponds to the cutting step in the sidestepping task.
Yeah, wow.
So yeah.
Wow. And then so you did that dynamically and isometrically, and then if you could, what would you recommend? Say you wanted to do an intervention with those exercises or something similar around those angles. Would you recommend people approach that isometrically, or should they approach it dynamically? What would be the sort of the recommendation around that?
Yeah, so we did like an intervention based on that for 4 weeks, and we, as you said, we split the groups into like a traditional dynamic intervention group, which consisted of like squats, hip thrusts, and calf raises, and just the volume of each exercise was adjusted to the individual needs of the athlete. And on the other side, we did the isometric intervention. Again, the volume was adjusted to the individual needs. And well, I'm still processing the change of direction data, but so far what I can tell is that obviously the group that trained in a dynamic way increased their 1RMs in a quite meaningful and significant way, while also increasing their isometric scores a bit. And on the other way, the isometric group increased their isometric strength quite a bit, while at best maintaining their dynamic strength. So a couple of them lost a couple of kgs on the squat and hip thrust, but improved their isometric way, which again indicates to like specific adaptation to what you do. And yeah, I'm still excited and keen to get my results and go through all the data, but I'm gonna talk on this in the ASCA conference later this year. So hopefully by then I can tell you more.
Sure, cool. And then I know this discussion at the ASCA conference, and listeners might actually be listening to this in past tense right now, but it's on single joint training and the ability of like single joint training to impact the cutting ability and the change of direction ability of the athlete. And it makes a lot of sense to me because obviously, look, if the multi-joint movements, but if one part of that is weak, then it's going to detract from the whole when you're actually doing that. So what are the sort of, you've kind of touched already, but and how you've approached it with the seated calf, the hip extensor, the isometric squat or the squatting. But what are these like possible causes in these change of direction or cutting deficit? Is it just isolated muscle groups, or is it a coordinative aspect? What are you thinking around that?
So, again, tackling this from a joint dominance and movement strategy point of view, in my understanding, such dominances are a function of the individual system paired with the exposure to a sport. And with this, I mean the individual anthropometrics, aka your height, your weight, your segment lengths, your segment masses, and other organismic constraints such as mobility and strength and what have you, in combination with the repetitive exposure to distinct movement patterns specific to your sport. Or in other words, how the athlete looks like and what he or she does on a repeatedly. And this might manifest itself in functional but as asymmetrical adaptation, i.e. just playing one sport might develop distinct strengths and weaknesses upon the kinetic change when we look at this in a joint by joint approach. So it's just a function of the way you are and a function of how you behave with your environment, which then ends in different strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, cool. Now then, and so people have got these different strengths and weaknesses. What's the best way for coaches to identify these strengths and weaknesses? Like, what's the recommendation on that? Do they need to have force plates and break it down like you've done, or how would you recommend?
So, well, obviously that's the $1 million question, and which is of big importance to me, that I want to give coaches a way to quantify it, to test what each athlete looks like. And also during this intervention, or during this testing with my PhD studies, on top of all the change of direction tasks, we did a counter movement jump and a single leg drop jumps to see if such joint dominances in vertical jump tasks correspond to joint dominances in change of direction tasks. So ultimately, my goal is to downscale this big 3D analysis of an unplanned change of direction task in a biomechanics lab to a 2D vertical jump task. But again, give me another year or so and I can give you the answer if that holds true. So if like one movement strategy, one preferred movement strategy corresponds to different other athletic movements. And if that would be the case, that'd be cool. And it would indicate us coaches, okay, this is the weakest link in the kinetic chain. And in order to prep my athletes for worst case scenarios, this is what I need to strengthen. But until then, my super unscientific suggestion would be to just watch the athlete move, squat, hinge, jump, and just get an idea which joints go through big ranges in order for the athlete to produce torque. And also what I found from this obviously very biased approach, when I ask my athletes what their all-time favorite lower body lift is, squat or deadlift. And this also might give you some indication, okay, where the strong beats at the hip or the knee, if that makes sense.
100%. It's really interesting around the jumps, and because obviously cutting is like a jump, right? And very interesting. If you had to pick one now, are you seeing things that are really similar in deficits in cutting that you're also seeing in, like, say, the single leg drop jump? Are you seeing those things at the moment?
Again, I'm still processing the data, but what we see that generally stronger athletes, like your gym strong, are more hip dominant, and athletes who are weaker rely more so on their knee extensor strength, which ultimately makes sense because if you're weak and rely on your knee joints, that's where also the majority of your injury occur. So probably with easy and simple ways just to get like the global strength up, make the athlete as strong as possible, will ultimately help them to reduce such injuries, which also is in accordance with a lot of evidence, what we have out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's very interesting because obviously in the gym, it's very sort of linear, vector, so on. And then when you're doing your cutting movements, there's oblique vectors and other type of like directions of forces. And it's very interesting, that transfer that you get from the gym to the field. And I think the next question that I'd be really interested in for you is like, how has your practice changed from, because obviously you're a coach at the same time, right? How's your practice changed from when you began your PhD to where you are now, a year and a half later? Like what's changed in your, as you've gone along in your outside work not in the PhD?
Probably because I was kind of working and coaching in the gym like 24/7. I was trying to solve all my movement problems and with gym solutions. So I was super keen to make them strong, make them jump higher in the gym and what have you. But now in the scenarios I'm coaching in, on the pitch, on the field with minimal equipment, but still need to make the athlete as robust as possible. So probably having this transition from only gym to only on field, on pitch, changed the way how I approach my programming and my exercise selection, obviously. And I'd say the results are at least as good as only having one approach. So yeah, like with movement, with your on-field exercise selection, we can have, I think, an at least as good approach to prepare our athletes for in-game situations as we have in the gym.
100%. I think that's a really common experience for strength and conditioning coaches. You start off with the gym as the solution for a lot of things, and like they say, a hammer's only good for a nail sometimes, or you know what I mean. If you only tool as a hammer, all you see is nails. So it's definitely very true. So, mate, what are your practical recommendations for coaches out there listening? What are the sort of practical recommendations you would have for coaching or wanting to develop change of direction ability, wanting to develop unplanned change of direction or agility ability as well?
That's a good one. Probably the short and simple answer would be just make the athlete as anti-fragile and robust as possible so they can experience the highest quality and quantity of sport-specific training and game exposure. Only there you will develop your specific perceptual visual abilities, which then have a big impact on your on-field decision-making, aka agility. And right now, I'm quite reserved and skeptic whether we as SNCs can actually improve agility within our practice. And with agility, I mean the combination of perception and action. But we surely have a meaningful impact with our work to support this essential athletic ability. However, my biggest concern is that we underestimate the inherent complexity and specificity of not just the perceptual cognitive, but also the emotional and behavioral demands during in-game scenarios, which therefore limits the transfer of whatever agility drill we do during our practice. And when I scroll through Instagram or Twitter or what have you, often I see very creative and impressive agility drills where one or more athletes have to respond to other athletes in order to develop those visual cognitive abilities, like different progressions and setups of 1v1, 1v2, your different mirror drills, what have you. But however, I feel there are still a large limitations for such drills with the goal to improve perception and action, because only within representative tasks, which includes the whereabouts of your opponents, your teammates, external pressure, fatigue level, and many, many more specific aspects, only there you can develop this ability. So at least that's how I understand it. And also there are like a lot of research groups from the ecological dynamics with the specific aim to investigate different means and methods on how to best improve your visual cognitive abilities that actually transfer to in-game scenarios. And still, they haven't come up with a definitive answer, although they're doing it for decades. And then the SNC community came along with all those fancy drills and be like, yeah, done deal. This is the way how you improve your visual cognitive abilities. And I think that's way too simple. And there is still little to no methods within our practice to fast track this ability. But again, I'm very happy to be proven wrong. And with my work, aka increasing the physical capacities and preparing them for worst case scenarios, I can give the athletes the opportunity to experience greater qualities and quantities of deliberate practice. And yeah, that's how I understand my role as an SNC.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, a lot of that stuff crosses over into like a technical coach's domain, and where you sit and where you're involved in the sort of dynamics where you work. It can be quite interesting at times around that. You've talked about sort of increasing the knee extensors, the hip extensors, the ankle flexors ability. Do you need to pay any attention with cutting movements to, say, the lateral hip or the medial hip, like the adductors, the glutes? Like, do those play a role for you in preparing people to be able to do more in the sport and to build their sort of resiliency, as you mentioned?
Yeah, surely. So like with hip strength or hip extensor strength, like there are other parts of the hip which have a big impact on like the lumbar pelvic stability during cutting steps. So like obviously all your external rotators, your abductors, also your adductors, like they need to be surely as strong as possible to minimize any energy leakage during the task, and also like to prevent any misalignment of the lower limb during such tasks. So yeah, it's not just about hip extensors, but all the structures around your hip that make up like a solid platform to produce force from.
Mm-hmm. Any go-to exercises for those groups?
Probably again, if you ask me what to do in the gym, like all your squats, deadlifts, hip thrusts, all your single leg work, like I wouldn't say there's one exercise better than the other, but just like the right combination of all of them. Yeah.
Cool. Anything else practically? Anything else for recommendations for like change of direction or agility? Actually, one thing I was going to ask you about, it's been in my mind. People talk about having offensive and defensive agility, and like one is obviously going to where somebody is, one is going somewhere where that person isn't. And they like apparently it uses different parts of your brain. Is that true? And does that stuff, training that stuff in a general sense, does that help you with your sort of unplanned change of direction?
Again, I would be very shy and skeptic about if like surely we can design drills where like our defensive players have to do some defensive action in their unplanned change of direction tasks, and they have to respond to the other athlete and like close the distance as fast as they can get. But again, in my understanding, I just increase the robustness and resiliency of the athlete, and this is way too specific. So I would argue this is again the head coach's job to like give them the technical and tactical abilities to be in the right spot at the right time in this specific scenario. So again, surely in my past I've done different offensive and defensive drills in the hopes to elicit a meaningful transfer. But right now I'm kind of shy about that. I rather, like, as I said, increase their physical preparedness and expose them to worst case scenarios in the hopes that they minimize any possible injury risks when they experience such worst case scenarios on the pitch on the weekend when they have game day. So I'm probably, with my approach or with my exercise selection that I'm running with my athletes, I'm probably super simple and just try to get the best out of them with the basic drills and make them good movers, make them resilient, independent of the task and the situation they are in, so they can handle whatever load.
It's cool. Very good. Very interesting. Mate, I want to move next. I know you did a presentation for the ASCA in the Southeast Asian Conference. Maybe it was in Singapore just recently. And that was on speed development. So I want to, obviously, in field and court sports, it's like change of direction and speed development. Those are your things that physically you're going to train people for. Some of the big rocks. Let's talk a little bit about speed development. What are the sort of things you look for, the biomechanics, whatever that you look for with speed development, max velocity, something along those lines?
Good. I'd say in general, you need to have the capacity and the skill to apply large magnitudes of force within minimal time frames into the ground and be able to tolerate it. So in order to reach high velocities, you need to apply high amounts of force during the first half of the ground contact, or especially during the first half of the ground contact. And so the magnitude of force that you can apply within 30 to 50 milliseconds has a meaningful relationship with the velocity you reach. And to keep it simple, or in my understanding, if we think about the leg as a rigid spring, you want to load the spring, i.e. put as much energy as possible into it during the early stance, so the spring can release all the energy in the propulsive phase of the ground contact and propel you forwards. And although this super simple explanation or example hopefully explains why the popularity of horizontal force production is kind of misleading, as only focusing on the result, your horizontal force, which is the result, and not the cause, i.e. your ability to load the spring, is an incomplete interpretation of the available evidence. And lots of the papers argue that the skill of horizontal force production is way more important than the magnitude of the force vector that the athlete can produce. And this is likely not a question to be answered by this kind of data set. However, if we add another layer of complexity to this kind of simple model, we need to acknowledge that the lower limb most likely acts as a torque accentuated spring. With this, I mean you surely need to have your stiffness qualities around your ankle and your knee joint, but also have the muscular capacity around your hip in order to be able to utilize those stiffness qualities. And here lies the problem, or the explanation why we see so many papers showing a benefit purely by increasing your hip extensor strength, and therefore see also speed improvements, as only the optimal combination of vertical stiffness around your ankle and your knee joints in combination with your hip extensor capacities will eventually improve your speed. And you need to target the individual weakness. And I argue that the majority of athletes have experienced a lot of structured and progressive training to improve your vertical stiffness, be it all your heavy resistance training, all your plyos in all sorts and fashions. However, very little athletes have had the same focus of training to elicit meaningful gains in their hip extensors. That's why there are a couple of papers showing positive results after a period of only hip thrusting. And at least that's the explanation that makes sense to me. So this is most likely not a question what method of exercise is better, but again, what is the weakest link in my athletes? Do I need to increase the hip extensor capacities or vertical stiffness? And then just pick and choose your exercise in order to increase your distinct capacities, which, however, still doesn't tell you if you can also utilize this during the skill of sprinting. So again, this is my gym approach, my gym solution for on-field problems.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, because obviously there is an argument that you let the sort of sport take care of the sprinting, you know what I mean, and that they're doing. Do you think that's enough? If people are only sprinting during the actual sports performance, is that enough to actually improve speed or to get enough for speed development?
So we know that in order to increase sprinting speed, you need to expose your athletes to max velocities. And max velocities are highly unlikely to be reached in any of your sport-specific sessions. But within a game, you seem to get much closer to those max velocities. And there is some evidence that shows the inherent speed differences between practice sessions and in-game exposure. And based on a bit of my GPS data from the footy team that I support, I can see the same pattern. So again, if you want to prep your athletes for in-game worst case scenarios, I argue that you do your athlete a big disservice if you do not do maximal sprint training in your practice. And by that, I mean just isolated 30 to 40 meter straight line sprinting with max effort, as little fatigue as possible in a regular and structured way. So just playing a sport will not improve your speed capacities, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any sort of practical recommendations for like what coaches should be looking for in and around the mechanics or the coordination, ways of figuring out of, hey, maybe this is an ankle stiffness problem, like the spring problem, or maybe it's a hip extensor problem. Do you have any sort of practical recommendations on that for coaches?
Probably the easiest way would be just to expose them to max velocities on a regular and progressive fashion, because still I think like the tool or the exercise of exposing the athlete to max velocities is inherently underused in team sport athletes, because like still from based on my experience, like hardly any team sport athletes had like regular exposure to max velocities, and just by sprinting maximally fast in a weekly fashion will improve your sprinting speed. But like again, you need to do it on a regular base, max intensities, as little fatigue as possible, enough rest in between. So all those factors you need to account in to make your speed training effective at the end of the day.
100%, 100%. Any sort of recommendations for coaches about what to look for when they're doing it, like qualitatively or subjectively? What do you look for when you're watching your athletes sprint?
So I think we all agree that having optimal mechanics are highly beneficial when it comes to max velocity, so you can apply your forces in the most effective and efficient way into the ground. However, we also need to agree that there are inherent differences those optimal mechanics might look like between athletes. So I feel more often than not, we try to force and drill every athlete into same or similar shapes and pattern, despite of the different organismic constraints. Probably the most common denominator for achieving high velocities is having an optimal lumbopelvic alignment during sprinting, which might or might not end in a optimal high knee position. And usually we cue the results, your high knee lift or your knee lift, and not the underlying cause, your posture. And probably one of the simplest ways to put the athlete into a position where you have no choice but maintain an appropriate posture is the use of wickets or mini hurdles. This subconsciously forces the athletes to change their mechanics. And with such sprints over wickets or mini hurdles, the goal is here to, again, sprint as fast as possible without kicking them. However, it is not guaranteed that each athlete will benefit from such exposure ASAP. Usually they are a bit slower over wickets as they have to use certain structures or pattern which they haven't before. So this can also be seen as a kind of special strength exercise, which just takes time to develop over time. So this is how I approach mechanics. I try to make them feel subconsciously the change in their movement strategy, and always pair or finish with regular free sprints over different distances. And in the same token, I have minimized and almost eliminated the use of like your common traditional running drills, such be it all your wall drills, your A skips, B skips, or what have you. Just what I've experienced is that I had team sport athletes, and this is again just for my team sport athletes, that I had, some of them were super skilled with all your A skips, B skips, high skips, and what have you, but still sucked in sprinting and did not get a transfer in their sprinting mechanics. And on the other way, I had athletes who were kind of decent with their sprinting mechanics, but still were not able to do any of your A skips or B skips in a kind of good way. So I just started to question, okay, how does one skill transfer to the other? And again, in my understanding, if you want to get better at high speed sprinting, you need to sprint at max velocities, also to develop your coordinative system. So that's how I would approach it. Just get them, expose them to max velocities, and just the stimulus of max velocity will change mechanical overload, or will change their mechanical output and also their way how they sprint.
Yeah, cool.
Well, you have surely a big experience how to approach sprint development, so maybe
no, it's quite like it's really accurate, and like, so you can be at the like a warm-up track at a world championships or something like that, and the people that look the best drilling, they're probably not the fastest. Like the Japanese, if there was a gold medal for the best drills, they'd probably win a gold medal, just like off the top of my head, without being disrespectful to anyone. Or they're very well coached, but there's just just the realities of the situation. So, and I know this has been it's a frustration for many coaches in and around sort of speed development and so on. Is how do you get that transfer, not just from your sort of your gym-based exercises, but then also your track-based exercises, track-based drills, or your MAC drills, or even your wickets? How do you get transfer, more and more transfer from wickets and so on? So it's definitely a great question, and it's definitely it's common. So on that note, you've got you're using wickets. Are there any other practical recommendations you've got for coaches? Like you said, 30 to 50 meters. The athletes need to sprint further than that, or will they get enough if they sprint less than that? Like, what's the sort of volume you'd look at with your sprinting sessions? How would you sort of increase that, as you said, progressively? And you've kind of told us what you're looking for, but what's the sort of logistical things around how you run those speed sessions?
So again, probably do your basics well. And with basics, I mean like expose them to max velocities on a continuous and progressive way. And with this, I mean, you need to have your 100% effort. You need to have, based on the literature, at least 30 meters of distance where you hit your max velocity and then gets a bit of exposure at max velocity in, and have enough rest between your reps. And if any of those aspects lack, you're most likely just wasting your athlete's time and energy and not getting faster. And probably for practical recommendations, the most difficult ones in practice, or for me, is getting them to put maximal effort into each rep and also having the rest in between. So how I tackle that, literally, I educate them before every single rep of sprinting that they need to put in max effort, and that only at 100% effort they will get faster over times. Most of the time this approach works, but still sometimes you have your cool kids which still just jog around and just not sprinting at 100%. So what I've tried is that I've just simply pulled out my phone, started to film them, and told them this is going straight to Instagram. And with all your cool millennials, this works. Like, you'll be amazed how much more efforts they can put in now. So that's a good trick, but it doesn't work always.
That's a great tip. That's a great tip.
Yeah. Well, you need to know who you coach and how you get them. And also the other big issue that I have or had during my speed sessions was the rest in between. And still the rule of thumb is that you need at least 1 minute of rest per 10 meters of sprint still holds true. And because most team sport athletes are not used to do nothing, I just like to distract them and make them do some sort of single leg balance, hand-eye coordination drills, or like some neck strengthening exercises, just to give the system enough time to recover. I still would prefer them like just to sit them down, do nothing but breathing. But this is hard to achieve. And also in terms of distances, again, we know that we need at least like your 25 to 30 meters of acceleration before you hit max velocities, and then get some exposure in, so a couple of meters more. And when I set up the distances, I also like to lie to my athletes, as I usually set up the cones about 10% further than what I want them to sprint, because most of them are just lazy and start to decelerate a couple steps before they hit the cone. So yeah, here you go. Applied sprint training 101. Max intensities, enough rest, enough distance, and you'll be fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely for team sport athletes, the fillers in between for rest, the fillers that aren't going to tax them and they can still recover 100%. And also, yeah, it's just human nature to pull up early before a cone. It's just life. Everybody does it, no matter what. So you've got to have the cones a bit further out. They're great tips. Thank you, Daniel. Mate, I want to like, so obviously you're coaching at the moment. What does a speed or change of direction session look like? Do you put them both in at the same time? Say an athlete turns up, they do a warm up. What does that look like? Then they do a bit of sprint work. What does that look like? And what's going on there?
So usually right now we are in season with the footy team. So right now it's just me doing my warm-up twice a week for about 20 minutes. I start with a general warm-up just to get heart rate up, all your single leg skips, a bit of mobility stuff, what have you. And then usually I start the first like more intense exercise are the sprints. So again, expose them to max velocities at least once a week over a distance of about 25 to 35 meters, 1 or 2 reps of that, and finish up with some change of direction tasks. And with that, I'm trying to expose them to kind of biomechanically worst case situation. And with this, I mean eliciting high knee valgus moments, which are usually tightly linked to your ACL injury risk. So in my understanding, or the way I approach it, if I can give them a bit of poison every now and then, like eliciting high knee valgus moments in a kind of safe, structured and progressive way, I can prepare my athletes for something that will happen in a game anyway. And avoiding loads like that will, in my understanding, not prepare them sufficiently enough for in-game scenarios. So in order to get high knee valgus moments, we know that the entry velocity of the cutting, or before the cutting task, the cutting angle and the time to preparation have a meaningful impact for those knee valgus moments. So having cuts somewhere between 60 and 90 degrees will likely be like your danger zone. This is where most of your ACL happens. And if I can expose them in a structured and progressive way to handle those loads in training, well, I hope I'm doing them a service in making them as robust and resilient as possible in the long term.
Mm-hmm. So how do you set that up? How do you set that up? Do you have like some cones set up that are at 60 to 90 degrees? Do you make them run at a certain pace into those cones? How does that look like to get those the 60 to 90 degrees, to get the speed and get the anticipation needed for you to kind of prepare them?
So probably one of my go-to drills is like a setup as you would have in your Y drill. So you have 2 cones about 5 meters apart. They have to sprint to one cone and then cut to your left or to right, and then aim for the other 2 cones which are on your side. And you can like adjust the setting of the cones where you want them to run to, and this determines your cutting angle. So I start like kind of shallow with about 45 degrees, and over the weeks I progress them to 60, 75, 90 degrees while maintaining the same entry velocity, and then over time going like from a 5 meter approach to like a 7.5, 8 meter approach, so they can hit this sidestepping maneuver at a higher velocity. But obviously this is in a planned condition, and if I want to make it unplanned, I'll just put one of the athletes on the cone where they have to cut and just give them the instruction to like show the athletes in which direction to cut. Although this is super unspecific, I don't expect to get any visual cognitive improvements. I just use this as a tool to minimize the time in order to prep for the cutting step. So the less time the athlete has to prep themselves and adjust their body for the cutting step, the higher the loading will be. So I use those 3 aspects in a progressive way to, again, elicit the worst case scenario on a regular basis.
Cool. And so those windows are running through in your Y test. For listeners out there, a 112 is another name for it. But those windows of cones just get smaller if you want them to cut at a tighter angle. I'd imagine you get them running in fast there. It's really good, really, really good. Mate, Daniel, it's been really interesting chatting to you this afternoon. I've learned a lot, and really I'm very eager to see the results of your PhD and what's going to come out of that. It's going to be great, I can imagine now. Mate, I've got a couple of quick questions for you, and these are just, you can elaborate on these. You can be one-word answers. It's your show, buddy, in this one. But What are you most excited about in the next sort of 12 to 18 months about developing in yourself or improving your own practice?
Well, probably this is exactly the time frame which I'm aiming to finish my PhD. So getting all the data in, analyzing, processing it all, and writing it up would be probably the answer from like my academic point of view. But from like a country point of view, like being as successful as possible with this in this current footy season, and try to give as much girls as possible the opportunity to get drafted in the AFLW from our team. So that would be kind of the next cool goal before the softball season starts again.
Okay, awesome. So, all right, next question. Besides journal articles or textbooks or something like that, what's on your bookshelf? Any? What are you reading right now?
Right now, I'm reading Skin in the Game from Nassim Taleb, and also Thinking Slow and Fast, or Thinking Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman. And I'm rereading the second book again because I'm kind of like fascinated by all things decision making, how emotion affect cognition, all things biases, and like all the stuff outside of our S&C environment like this.
Yeah, cool. So what have you got out of Thinking Fast and Slow? What would be your takeaway?
Probably the brain always wins, and it's hard to change people's biases about certain topics. And yeah, once someone is convinced or believes in something, you rather go with it than force your opinion upon him and try to like make the encounter as easy as possible, just like not by forcing your opinion on him, but acknowledging his biases or like your own biases, and like trying to be a good human being.
Sure. What about Talib's book? What do you got out of his book?
So far, it's a kind of like a tough read for me. There are cool stories, interesting stories, but I still struggle to get like a transfer for myself in my life, in my situation, out of his stories. And I'm still just like 100 pages in, and I hope I'll get like to more like hands-on messages or something more that I can use in my daily life. So far, it was just like a cool storytelling book.
Yeah, gotcha. Cool. Mate, like I said, it's been wonderful chatting to you. How do people get more information about Daniel? Like, where do they go? You're on Instagram, you're on Twitter, ResearchGate. What's the go for getting more information from
you? Yeah, probably on Instagram, I'm trying to share a bit of my coaching insights and my rationales behind my go-to drills and exercises, which my handle is coach_DK. Not very inspiring. And also on Twitter at Daniel Kadlec, but I'm just more of like reading other tweets than like putting myself out there. So those are probably the easiest ways to grab hold of me.
Awesome. And then for your research, for people wanting to keep up to date with your research, are you on ResearchGate or anything else, anything like that?
I am on ResearchGate, but to be honest, the last time I've updated something on there is quite a long time. So probably the easiest way to reach out to me is like by email, Instagram, Twitter.
Awesome. Mate, like I said, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the ASCA podcast.
Thank you.
Having you on. So there's some great practical takeaways there from Dan on change of direction, maximum velocity. I love the way he manipulates entry speed, cutting angle, and reaction with the Y or that 112 drill. Really awesome stuff. Also, I should note this podcast was recorded a fair while back now, and I know he's probably progressed his research findings considerably, so make sure you give him a follow on Instagram, Twitter, etc., and look him up on ResearchGate if you really want to follow what he's doing out there at Edith Cowan. Now, before I leave you, got to thank Val Performance again. great support of the ASCA and this podcast. They have some wonderful online workshops going on recently that you should check out, including, disclaimer, a little plug here, the team at the UFCPI in Shanghai. Anyway, of course, if you're interested in any of their products, make sure you check them out, valperformance.com. Honestly, don't think you can go wrong with them. So that's it for this episode. Make sure you catch up with our next one. Until you hear from me next, I'm Joseph Coyne. This is the ASA Podcast.